talk about, to me, why do we eat should be the first lecture. Understand why we should be talking about this at all. And then after that, move into maybe cell types, et cetera, but then into secretions that we have and motility. How do we get things to move from one spot to another? And we're going to start here with, through most of the length of the GI tract, we use smooth muscle to get from one place to another. And we have muscle that we'll be talking about next fall, mostly skeletal muscle, but we'll talk more about smooth muscle then as well. Some things we should recognize with smooth muscle is, I think you all know skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is flaccid, it's non-contracting, unless we tell it to contract through innervation by alpha motor neurons. Smooth muscle is different. Smooth muscle is constantly contracting. All we do is make it contract either more strongly or less strongly. So we modulate the strength of contraction of smooth muscle. And there's a variety of different things that can cause smooth muscle to be modulated. One simple one is, if you take a smooth muscle, grab the two ends of a smooth muscle cell and you pull on it, you stretch it, it'll reflexly contract without any neural innervation. So we know with patellar tendon tap, you tap your patellar tendon, there's a monosynaptic reflex that goes back to the spinal cord from muscle spindles, say, hey, it's a stretching, we don't want that to happen, and then they excite alpha motor neurons. That's a reflex contraction. There's nothing involved, no neurons, no chemicals, just you stretch it and it will contract. We make good use of that when we're regulating blood pressure and blood flow through arterioles. Another thing that we do have neural innervation. They're kind of loose, primarily loose synapses, and primarily through the parasympathetic nervous system, releasing acetylcholine. And then also local regulation, paracrines being released locally, and also endocrines, so circulating endocrines like gastrin can affect it, and cholecystokinin and secretin. So there's a broad range of how we can affect smooth muscle contraction. Lots of different things can, but it's always contracting at any time. You just make it stronger or weaker. Now we can divide smooth muscle in our GI tract into two main types. There's single unit smooth muscle and multi-unit smooth muscle. Single unit smooth muscle is it's where you have a network of smooth muscle cells and they're interconnected by gap junctions. So they're behaving, while there are many individual cells, they're behaving as though they're one cell. That's what the single unit, one unit. So if one of these smooth muscle cells contracts, they all begin to contract. Multi-unit smooth muscle, we don't have those gap junctions, and we're basically exerting punctate control, that we're going to be communicating with each of the individual muscle fibers to encourage it to contract or to relax, contract more or relax. So when you think of multi-unit smooth muscle, where with punctate or point-wise control, think, oh, this is where we control sphincters. So those doorways or openings that we can close or open between different components of the digestive tract. Single unit smooth muscle, if I contract one very quickly, the next and the next and the next would contract. So if you want to picture that, what might you see in that segment of the GI tract? A series of sequential contractions. That's important for peristalsis. So that's how I kind of hold on. Multi-unit smooth muscles for sphincters, single unit smooth muscle for peristalsis, or something else we'll talk about, especially in the colon, where you have one area of the colon contract and another area contract simultaneously, and then they relax, and then areas in between them contracted, and so ends up being sort of like you were kneading bread that was in a tube. And those are called segmentation contractions. Let's go zoom in on a smooth muscle cell and see why is it constantly contracting, and does that mean that they're all constantly contracted to a certain amount and sometimes we make it less and sometimes we make it more? No. What I mean by constantly contracting is if you looked at a smooth muscle cell, you would see that it contracts and then it relaxes, and it contracts and it relaxes, but it's always doing that. A skeletal muscle cell just sits there, I'm not contracting, and then you stimulate the alpha motor neuron and suddenly it contracts as long as the alpha motor neuron is being stimulated. So what's causing these smooth muscle cells to go through this cycle of contract and relax? The answer is, if we poked an electrode into a smooth muscle cell, we would get its membrane potential, and instead of having a resting membrane potential, what we would see is the membrane potential was constantly fluctuating. Picture a sine wave. It depolarizes gradually, and then it hyperpolarizes. And it depolarizes and it hyperpolarizes. That's what the resting membrane potential looks like in a smooth muscle fiber. And the way that works is whenever it depolarizes above threshold, picture a threshold level, see why there's some other differences with smooth muscle. But whenever it depolarizes above the threshold level, we start to generate action potentials. So during these slow waves, for the entire time we're above the threshold level, we start to generate a sequence of action potential. And with smooth muscle, when we generate action potentials, the smooth muscle contracts. Okay? So, two things going on here. One, just another kind of warning. Smooth muscle does not, the way an action potential affects smooth muscle is different from the way an action potential in a skeletal muscle cell would work. Specifically, smooth muscle cells don't use troponin and tropomyosin. Okay, that's what allows them to constantly be contracted. But what's important for us here is whenever this slow wave goes above threshold, we generate action potentials and the smooth muscle cell begins to contract more strongly. And that contraction will last, that stronger contraction will last as long as we're above threshold. One other thing to factor in. The further above threshold that our slow wave gets, the higher the frequency of action potentials. So if we had a slow wave that just got above threshold, we would start seeing action potentials produced. If we boosted that slow wave up so it went further above threshold, the action potentials start coming faster. The higher the frequency of action potentials, the stronger the contraction of the smooth muscle. Okay? Yeah.
So is this a trend?
To prove that we can now ask questions.
No, I just remember that we were talking about action potential last as an all or nothing response.
An action potential is an all or nothing response, yeah.
Okay, so what you just said though, I guess it got me confused. You said if you go higher than threshold.
If the slow wave goes, slow wave is not an all or none response. So, I don't know. Well, here, I've got it drawn. I think I'll be able to explain it in a minute. So, here's a recording. I'm pretending to quit me. In the stomach, and a cell in the stomach and a cell in the duodenum. Now I chose those two because we would see these slow waves throughout the digestive tract. But I picked the two extremes. The stomach has the slowest slow wave. It goes through about 3 cycles per minute. Okay? 20 seconds per cycle. The duodenum is the fastest. It goes through 12 cycles per second. I really worked hard to get these to work out. Took me like 6 months to get that done. Okay? Now, what I've tried to show here also is, let's say this is our threshold value for generating action potentials. And so what I can see is that the action potentials will begin once we cross threshold and end when we come back. And so I have a series of 4 action potentials floating on there, and another 4, and another 4. But each action potential I drew to the same height. Tried to. So the action potential still is all or none. The slow wave is not. And in the duodenum, you can see that I only had time for 2 action potentials on the top of each wave. But each action potential is a depolarization to the same level. Okay, and those action potentials, unlike what we see in neurons in skeletal muscle, a significant part of the smooth muscle action potential is calcium flowing into the cell. Okay, so on here, the action potential frequency on each slow wave is around 1 to 10 per second. So as long as you're above threshold, you're going to keep generating action potentials somewhere in that range. And then it says, depending on the level of the slow wave depolarization. So what if this slow wave actually was shifted up higher? Okay? A couple of things are going to happen. We'll see in a minute. Now that each action potential, I said these action potentials are different from what we see in neurons and skeletal muscle. They last quite a bit longer, 10 to 20 milliseconds. In part, or in large part, because calcium is an important component of it. And so they're primarily due to calcium entry. And the calcium is promoting the increased contractile strength.
So what exactly is the slow wave potential?
What's causing it, I don't know exactly, but it's basically opening and closing of different ion channels. For instance, one thing I could picture was what we saw there. This kind of is behaving like a pacemaker for these cells. What we saw in cardiovascular is that phase 4, the sloped phase 4, in cells with pacemaker capabilities, due largely to closing of voltage-gated, or closing of potassium channels. If we close off potassium channels, potassium permeability decreases, and so our membrane potential will depolarize. Golden equation put to the test. So we could be getting this if we had potassium channels which were gradually closing, and then potassium channels that were real. But I don't know. Okay, so I think on the next page,
Wait, can you elaborate on the multi-unit contraction again? Like,
multi-unit is going to behave differently, somewhat differently. Here, with multi-unit, primarily sphincters, and the way our GI tract is set up, we want those sphincters most of the time to be closed. Think of them as sort of like watertight compartment doors on a ship, except usually we leave those open unless you're going to, there's an imminent attack, and then you close them to protect those different segments. So with our sphincters, we want them closed unless we say you should open. And now that produces a kind of an issue or a potential problem, because what if I were to tell you, let's use, we're going to use your hand as a sphincter. I want you to close the sphincter, make a fist. I want you to be determined about it. I mean, make a fist. I don't want, if I walked up to you and I grabbed your hand and tried to open it, I want you to make sure that I couldn't open it. I want you to contract that and keep it contracted. No resting. still contracting it? Okay, is it starting to hurt? Or become uncomfortable? Keep doing it. Welcome to the life of a sphincter muscle. I want you to keep doing it. We used to do this sometimes as kids for fun, that we would kind of block off the blood flow and rub the hand. I don't know why we rubbed the nose. Okay? But just keep, you can do it this way. I want you to keep contracting it strongly. Now, what I'm going to tell you to do, and you have to listen to this before you do it, is I'm going to, in a moment, have you stop doing that. And I want you to open, and when I tell you, keep contracting strongly right now. When I tell you to do so, I want you to open your fist as slowly as you possibly can. I want you to do it so it's just really slow and smooth. And what I think you're going to experience, if we've been doing it, still contracting strongly, is as you go to open up your hand, what's going to happen is, while you're trying to do it as slowly as possible and smoothly, you're going to be able to feel it through some of the jerks. Okay? So let's try that now. Just slowly try and open your hand. First it's going smooth. And now I'm starting to just gently try to open my fingers and they're stuck. Anybody else's fingers get stuck? That you have to use extra, I still got mine stuck. I did the job. And then, anybody else? And mine are still, I'm just trying to gradually open them and, oops, there, it just did a little jerk free. So you can start to feel them kind of open up in little chunks. Don't worry, if you really try to force it, it's not a problem at all. Okay, what we were trying to design there is something like that happens in sphincters where they can stay contracted and it's a latch mechanism. I don't know exactly how it works with sphincters, but if I'm actively contracting skeletal muscle to keep my fist made, then I'm burning a bunch of ATP. So let's make this a little bit easier, a little bit more efficient, that there's a latch mechanism that sphincter muscles, when they contract, it's like they get stuck in the closed or contracted position, sealing off those watertight doors. And it's only when something comes along and says, time to relax. Okay, and then it allows time for food to pass through. Isn't the body amazing? Okay, and if you didn't get your fingers to get stuck, then you can keep working on it on your own. Okay, two things I'm going to see here. One, the longer I'm above threshold, the longer the time I spend contracted. So when the stomach begins to contract more strongly, that contraction is going to last longer than something I see in the duodenum. And two, if I can shift the baseline of this slow wave upward, the higher above threshold, the higher the frequency of action potentials, the stronger the contraction. So if I want an area of smooth muscle to contract more strongly, I just need to shift the baseline of the slow wave up. If I wanted to contract less strongly, I shift the baseline down. And I think I put that on the next page. Okay, so here's how things like stretch or acetylcholine released by postganglionic parasympathetic neuron or hormones may stimulate contractile strength. All they're going to do, where we saw the stimulus, whatever it is, I kept the same frequency of the slow wave. I just shifted the baseline up. So now I can see here two things have happened. The duration spent above threshold is longer, so the contractions become more prolonged. And the amplitude of the wave, I get further above threshold, and I've shown that the frequency of the action potentials has increased. And that's going to strengthen the contractile strength. So increased duration of contraction, increased strength of contraction. Now, we can also decrease the baseline level of slow wave, things like norepinephrine or epinephrine, postganglionic sympathetics. They hyperpolarize the slow waves and they inhibit contraction. Okay? But we don't have we don't have troponin and tropomyosin in smooth muscle, so they can always be contracting. There's always some baseline level of calcium there that is going to be stimulating them to contract. We just make the contractions stronger or weaker. Okay, now I do put in a disclaimer here, called it a note with a star next to it, so it must be important. Dr. Hans would have put that in his definition. Is that while I can talk about the acetylcholine from the postganglionic parasympathetics or the norepinephrine from the postganglionic sympathetics affecting these smooth muscle cells, by and large, the way we use the autonomic nervous system isn't for its direct effects on these smooth muscle cells, but more to modulate the activity of neurons that are contained in the enteric nervous system. Okay, so the myenteric plexus and the submucosal plexus. Myenteric plexus is there, this network or wreath of neurons, which is there to regulate smooth muscle activity along much of the length of the GI tract. The submucosal plexus, those neurons are there primarily to regulate blood flow and secretions. Okay, sphincter contractions, types of contractions here. You're going to get sphincter contractions, basically group of smooth muscles at one location to serve as a barrier. Stay contracted most of the time, but then relax to allow contents to move through. And the first sphincter contraction I think of when I think of these would be the pyloric sphincters separating the stomach from the duodenum. And most of the time it's there preventing chyme from entering the duodenum, but then it relaxes and we get gastric emptying. Something that's kind of more interesting, I think, is peristalsis. Okay, I think I mentioned before, being from Wisconsin, we all inherently know how to milk a cow. It's a peristaltic-like movement to get the milk expressed. I assume it would work with goats, but I have no idea. We get banned goats from the state of Wisconsin, even therapeutic goats. We cannot do goat yoga in Wisconsin. Anybody done goat yoga? I'm easily. I saw it on the internet, so it must be true. You do yoga with a goat. I'm not sure why. Stay away from goats. Okay. So, peristalsis. This is how the major way that we propel food through our GI tract. And then I put in something scary, comma, usually underlined in the oral to anal direction. So normally we're squeezing food all the way from our beginning, from our esophagus all the way to the anus. And usually that's the direction it works. There are exceptions. Okay, now this requires us to coordinate contractions, sequential contractions of rings of smooth muscle. Okay, and we've got two things going for us. One, we have single unit smooth muscle, so they have connections. And two, we have the myenteric plexus to help coordinate that effort to prolong it through a further greater distance than what would happen with simple direct current flow. Okay, so coordinated sequence of contractions, the myenteric plexus coordinates it. So if you wanted to inhibit peristalsis, one way to do it is interfere with the function of the myenteric plexus. So you could go in and destroy it, that seems a little bit severe, or you could inhibit it by blocking the acetylcholine receptors with atropine. Okay? Now one of the things, so what would happen there is peristalsis would stop or be greatly decreased. Another way you could interfere with peristalsis is to have somebody under deep level of anesthesia. So have any of you ever had surgery that you had an inhalant anesthetic, and once you come out of that anesthesia, you're not getting anything by mouth until when? When did they finally start to be able to eat again? Especially if it was abdominal surgery. Huh? Several hours? Did they do anything before you got your food? Could be a nurse, probably, huh? They listen for bowel sounds. Ever had some healthcare professional putting their stethoscope on your abdomen, you're saying, no, my heart's up here? Listening for bowel sounds, what's that got to do with anything? That means peristalsis has begun again, and you have an empty GI tract, and so it's not technically empty, you've got probably gas bubbles in there, and so you start to hear the sound of the gas, just like with your stomach starting to rumble or grumble. Okay? So they're listening for the peristaltic waves. If you ate something and you didn't have peristalsis going, then that stuff just sits in your stomach, let's say, and that's not called digestion over a long period of time, that's called decomposition. That's not so good for you. Okay, so damage to myenteric plexus or presence of atropine can prevent peristalsis. Now, how do you get peristalsis to occur? Okay, we've got to get it started. And the primary way we generate peristalsis is by local distension of some segment of the GI tract. You've probably experienced some of this stuff. So what happens is, if you have a local distension of the GI tract, you're stretching the smooth muscles in that segment of the GI tract, and they will depolarize and reflexly contract on their own. Okay, so distension can trigger peristalsis, and it makes sense. It doesn't just have to be distension, it could be a local irritation, chemical irritation or physical irritation, or it can be just due to parasympathetic discharge. Some other reason your body is causing profound parasympathetic discharge, and it's going to stimulate peristalsis. Okay, so what's going on with peristalsis? That local distension is going to trigger about a 2 to 3 centimeter segment of your GI tract to contract. And as it begins to contract, it's going to trigger a coordinated sequence called the myenteric reflex, also called the peristaltic reflex. So here I have, and this is a peristaltic reflex, I have a bolus of food, it's the mouth and the anus, so somewhere in between, got this bolus of food, and it's stretching that part of the GI tract. That causes that small segment of the GI tract to contract due to the stretch. Now here's where the really cool part happens. That triggers this myenteric reflex, where the first thing that happens is this ring of contraction initially moves back toward the mouth. So here's the distension, and the first movement of this constriction is back toward the mouth about 1 to 2 centimeters. Not far, just a little ways. Okay, so we backtracked about 1 to 2 centimeters. And once we got back there, we've gotten behind our bolus that's stretching things. Now, once we get back there, the next thing that happens, and this is where the myenteric plexus is really going to be important, is we're going to relax this segment on the other side of the bolus. So we're going to inhibit contraction on the anal side of this bolus. And only once that's happened do we start to see this ring of contraction, this peristaltic wave, move from oral to anal in direction about 5 to 10 centimeters. So this contractile ring is going to be pushing from behind the bolus, pushing the bolus forward into an area that has a decreased resistance because it's been inhibited from contracting. After about 5 to 10 centimeters, that peristaltic wave peters out. But once it does, the bolus is now 5 to 10 centimeters forward, and it triggers the next part of the peristaltic wave because it's distending a new segment. You may have experienced this. Have you ever were you trained at some point about chewing your food before swallowing it? Some people were told you have to chew your food X number of times before you're allowed to swallow it. I don't know. My mother just didn't care that much about me. She said, you should chew it. It's a good idea. So even though we've been well instructed about that, babies don't know that, right? That's why we chop up their food for them. Or you give them something that dissolves in their mouth, okay? Otherwise, you put it in their mouth, they're gonna try swallowing it, and they have no teeth to swallow with either. I know, I've got a lot of grandchildren. So, have you ever, even though you're well trained, have you ever been really liking something so much you just had to swallow it right away? And the thing I think of is, sometimes I get a piece of steak, and I chew it once or twice. It tastes so good. It's like, the only way I can, it's sort of like hexokinase is the glucose. I'm gonna trap this thing. You might come and rip this out of my mouth, but if I swallow it, you can't get to it. So I chew it once or twice, and I swallow it. And I regret it almost immediately. Anybody ever been in there? Okay. Maybe okay, let's try and relate to the vegetarians and vegans. Sometimes you make a peanut butter sandwich, or maybe you put peanut butter on a cracker or celery. I don't care where you put the peanut butter. Sometimes you may even just take a spoon, get the peanut butter, and put it in your mouth, and it tastes so good you swallow it. Anybody ever had swallowed a glob of peanut butter and it's like, I wish it had dissolved a little bit more? Anybody there with me? Okay, so now if we got, okay, if you have never experienced either of those two things, raise your hand. Aren't you, Kurt?
Allergic to peanut butter.
And meat?
No, that's true.
You can't afford steak. You're still a student. You're not going to be able to afford steak at the tuition levels we have. You're not going to afford steak until you're about 60. Let me tell you, it's wonderful. Okay, but you can feel it going down your esophagus, can't you? Either of those two situations. It's how I've got a good idea where my esophagus is. That it's somewhere over kind of here, I think, because I can feel it going down the whole way until it just kind of plops out into my stomach, and it's, I'm glad that's over with, and the next thing I know, I've got another piece of steak and I'm doing the same thing. Okay, so these peristaltic waves are just moving things along, usually oral to anal, and they peter out, and then they continue on, another one and another one. And this is how it happens, and that's why it's a coordinated effort, and we need the myenteric plexus to do it. That's peristalsis. Mixing contractions are important not to move things from one place to another through the length of the GI tract, but rather to get things to mix together. We've got a lot of GI secretions and whatever we're ingesting. Okay, so this is the way we produce chyme. And chyme is being made. The secretions plus what you ate is equal to chyme. And the chyme contains the digestive enzymes that are breaking things down. And the chyme is making things fluid, which makes everything easier to absorb. And we don't want just the one layer of chyme sitting on that brush border. Things are being absorbed, but what about everything in the middle of the GI tract? We want to keep continually mixing things. So these are called mixing reactions. There's two types. Use smooth muscle to do it. The first type is we already have the components for doing that, is we need a sphincter, and we need it to be contracted. And the other thing we need is peristalsis. And so now we're going to start a peristaltic wave pushing the chyme toward the closed sphincter. And as we push the chyme toward the closed sphincter, what happens is the pressure on the chyme builds up because the peristaltic wave is pushing it, it's got nowhere to go. Until pressure builds up, it's either got to go through the closed sphincter or through the backflow through the peristaltic wave. The sphincter is the higher resistance, it's the stronger one, and so we get this backflow. And when it flows back, it's turbulent flow. Just like when you're measuring blood pressure and you press in on the artery, what happens is you occlude the artery, and when you finally release the pressure enough, finally you get a squirt of blood through the cuff, and it's turbulent flow and it makes a sound. In this case, with the GI tract, what we're trying to do is mix things, and so that turbulent flow is going to mix things around. Okay, that's one type of mixing reaction. Peristaltic wave headed toward a closed sphincter. This is how your stomach really operates. Okay, the other type of mixing reaction I mentioned briefly earlier, which is just, here I associate it primarily with the colon, and that's where we're trying to, in the colon, by the time we get to the colon, we've absorbed the nutrients we're going to get. What we're doing in the colon is trying to get back the fluid that we secreted, and so finish off fluid absorption and also ion absorption. And so as we're passing through the colon, or along the colon, the chyme is becoming thicker and thicker and becomes particulate. It's becoming feces. And so here we use, what we want to do is keep turning things over to be able to get the water out of the feces to be. And just like in the summer, if you have a garden, the winter's finally over, getting ready to plant, you go out, you turn the soil, you spade up the soil, you turn it over. And what you're doing is getting the water to evaporate. So you're getting your soil dried out enough that you're not going to drown your seeds or seedlings. Gardening tips too. So what you do there is have these segmentation contractions. As you keep doing this, different places, you develop between the two contracting segments, you have a gap, and that's where all the material is. That's called anhostration. Okay, and you can see that if you have somebody drink a radio-opaque dye and you do a fluoroscopy of their digestive tract, you'll see these kind of bumps of the radio-opaques. And that's anhostration. So all we have to do there, sort of like kneading dough, is have them contract and relax, another group contract and relax. That also is going to be under the direction of the myenteric plexus. Another thing we should recognize is we need to also match blood flow to what area of the GI tract is currently operating. So we want the most blood flow to be going to the cells that are most active. And so over time, as you go through after eating a meal, you'll see increased blood flow going to different segments of the GI tract. They need oxygen, and also we need blood flow to pick up the nutrients and send them on to the rest of the body. Different hormones are going to be working on this. There's a variety of ways that we regulate blood flow in the areas. You learned some of that in cardiovascular last fall, but a number of digestive hormones can act as vasodilators, including vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. Makes sense given the name, VIP. Cholecystokinin and gastrin and secretin. When we learned about cholecystokinin and secretin, I said here are three main functions. there are more functions than those three main ones, and they can vasodilate. So when they're there, we're decreasing resistance to blood flow to the GI tract, which means an increased share of blood flow will go to the GI tract. Some other things, local regulators would be collidin and bradykinin, are both vasodilators. We see in the GI tract histamine also as a vasodilator. We saw that when we talked about gastric secretion. And then an important one would be a drop in PO2. Here I'd also include an increase in PCO2. So low oxygen tension or high carbon dioxide tension are both important components of local regulation for blood flow. That if you have a more metabolically active cell, because hey, I'm secreting or I'm absorbing, I'm using ATP, I need to make more, I consume more oxygen, then local oxygen levels will drop, and that will cause vasodilation of the precapillary sphincter along the in that segment of the GI tract. And then more globally, parasympathetic innervation vasodilates the GI blood vessels, the increased blood flow to them, and the sympathetics vasoconstrict. Sympathetics fight or flight. So that's the kind of the trigger for if you're exercising a lot, and you do it right after you eat a meal, the exercise is going to cause peripheral vasodilation for the muscles in the area of the muscles that you're using. Sympathetic outflow is also going to be there primarily to increase cardiac output by the heart to fuel this increased need for blood. But simultaneously, with the sympathetics helping to increase cardiac output and the local vasodilation in your skeletal muscle blood vessels, what's also happening is you're going to constrict the blood vessels in your gut. As a result, if you've just eaten a meal, and you've got cells in your GI tract that are working, and they're being deprived now of blood flow because that's all going off to skeletal muscle, that can result in them becoming depolarized, causing muscle spasm contraction. So you start to get cramps. That's why you shouldn't go swimming for a half hour or whatever it is after you ate, or an hour. How long were you told to wait before you went swimming after you ate?
Half hour.
30 minutes? Okay. I don't know why. As a kid, I thought there was something magical about that time. 29 minutes, I was going to drown. 30 minutes, I was going to be okay. Okay? And it turns out I float really well. Didn't matter at all. Okay, so that's the idea behind that. And what else do I have here? Okay, some other things. Chewing. So some specific things. Chewing, fancy term, mastication, it's a reflex loop. It's actually a simple monosynaptic reflex loop once we get it. So I know that there is conscious control. So if I asked you right now, start chewing, how many of you could do it? Try it. Start chewing. Okay? Now, what if I said, start chewing, I'll do it a little differently. How many of you have gum in your mouth right now? It's not something I get upset about. How many of you, it's okay, how many of you have been chewing your gum during the lecture? Was it just sitting there? Okay. How many of you had to be, were thinking about it, were consciously aware that you were chewing your gum? I mean, how many of you faced the unenviable decision, like Sophie's Choice, almost as severe? I can either listen to Tim or chew my gum. Did you have to make a decision which one you were going to do? Or did you find you could chew gum and listen to Tim simultaneously? Okay. So you could focus on what I was saying. You could still be chewing your gum. You didn't need conscious control over it. The same thing, that's just chewing in general. How many of you, when you eat a meal, have to think, now I'm going to chew? Now I'm going to push my teeth up next to each other, now I'm going to take them back down. We don't need to do that. So this is a simple reflex. It will happen. Cows do this their entire life, constantly through the day. They chew on their cud, and cows are not really bright animals. We never say that in Wisconsin, one might overhear me. But they are not very bright. It would occupy too much of their cortex to have to do that. So chewing is a reflex loop that we can exert conscious control over. And the way that works, all we have to do when we decide to chew is say, I'm going to chew. We make the decision to chew, and then the reflex takes care of the details. We increase the surface area. Why do we chew? Increase the surface area so we can assist or aid in chemical breakdown, break down cellulose so we can eat vegetables and eat raw vegetables and actually get to nutrients inside the cell wall. It's encased in the cell wall by physically breaking the cell wall down, and also to help prevent excoriation. That's that scraping feeling you get if you prematurely swallow your steak or the peanut butter that will give you anaphylactic shock. Okay, so here's the chewing reflex. There's a bolus in the mouth, and what happens is it touches the inner linings of your mouth, and that causes a reflex inhibition of masticatory muscles. So they get inhibited, and when they're inhibited, they're no longer contracting, and so your jaw drops. As your jaw drops, that stretches the masticatory muscles, and that brings about a monosynaptic stretch reflex, which causes them to contract again, pushing the jaw upward, and that then causes material to be touching the linings of your mouth more, and you just keep going through that reflex over and over. Swallowing isn't as simple. Swallowing is, we've got to get food from our mouth into our esophagus without having it go down into our lungs. So we need to avoid the lungs. And has Dr. Landers talked about this in Head and Neck? I don't know if he does or not. Well, basically, we chew until we make a voluntary decision. It's conscious. We get the urge to swallow. And that decision is a learned response. It's, I think I have chewed this enough that it's safe to swallow now. That's what babies need to be trained in. And then also sometimes, even as adults, we make mistakes. When we reach that decision, first the tongue pushes upward, causing the contents in the mouth to be pushed back to the pharynx. And from that point on, everything becomes involuntary. Okay? We decided to swallow, our cortex is free to do whatever it wants because everything else is going to be involuntary. It's going to take, everything here take less than 2 seconds to occur, longer than 2 seconds for me to tell you that. Okay? What's in charge now is no longer the cortex, it's the swallowing center, subcortical, and what it's going to do first is inhibit the respiratory center. Respiratory center down in the medulla. It's causing this pattern of breathing, which you've been doing constantly since you were here. You didn't have to think about it. Again, it's subcortical. Okay, so we don't want to try and inhale as we're trying to swallow. Okay, and next thing, the presence of the food that our tongue just pushed back into our pharynx stimulates swallowing receptors. They're right around the tonsillar pillars. Okay, so touching them stimulates the swallowing, the rest of this sequence. We produce sensory action potentials from the swallowing receptors that go back into the central nervous system to the swallowing center, and then the swallowing center sends out afferents that are going to do the following thing. First, your soft palate moves up And that's trying to protect you from having food enter your nasal passages, or like if you laugh while you're drinking milk and the milk comes out your nose, your soft palate failed in that instance. Okay, so the soft palate moves up, and the Plato-pharyngeal folds approximate in the back. So they're trying to form a sieve. It's not a real effective one, but trying to keep things, a barrier to large masses from moving any further. But that chunk of steak sure got by. Next thing, the larynx is going to move up and anteriorly. And what that's going to do is help the epiglottis cover the larynx. And this is sealing off our respiratory tract and opening up our esophagus simultaneously. And I diagram that here. So food back here is now getting ready to be pushed downward, and our larynx moves up and forward, causing the epiglottis to cover over the larynx, and simultaneously kind of pulling open the uppermost portion of the esophagus. Up there, in the very early part of the esophagus, we have the upper esophageal sphincter, and it's going to relax at that point. Again, this is all reflex. That decreases the resistance for entry into the esophagus. At the very same time, we're increasing resistance for entry into the larynx. Finally then, the pharyngeal muscles contract, putting increased pressure on the food back in the pharynx and pushing it down where it takes the pathway of least resistance into the esophagus. Once it gets into the esophagus, we know what happens. Now there's a local distension, and it triggers a peristaltic wave. This is called the primary peristaltic wave. Okay, most of the time, if you take a drink of water or coffee and you swallow, that triggers a primary peristaltic wave. Thing is, as long as I'm sitting upright, the fluid goes all the way down the esophagus a lot faster than the peristaltic wave does. So we can largely get by for many things as long as they're not too large. Things, the peristaltic wave, anything liquid, this stuff is going to get there faster than peristaltic wave. But if I'm drinking my coffee or my water and I'm standing on my head, I can still get that to go. The peristaltic wave is still going to push that to my stomach. And people who are more adept than I am can try that. Just stand on your head and drink some water. Okay, but that's a primary peristaltic wave. You can get secondary peristaltic waves. And I didn't get done, so we'll have a short period of time after lunch, okay? So we'll pick up in the esophagus. There's just too many good stories. I still have to tell you about diarrhea and vomiting. Right after. Hi, Jake. And Sam, we both. So we're going to pick up what we had done, accomplished just before finishing up this morning was we chewed. We reached the point where we decided that I have chewed it into small enough pieces. Now I'm going to swallow it. And we went through what was involved with swallowing, also what was involved with chewing. And now we've gotten into the esophagus. I said that we move down the esophagus. Gravity does most of the work. We do produce peristaltic waves. There's a primary one. If we ate that large piece of steak or the sticky peanut butter and it gets stuck, that's going to generate a secondary or tertiary peristaltic wave until we push the bolus of food all the way down to the lower end of the esophagus. So now we're going to pick up the story with moving from the esophagus into the stomach. So if the peristaltic wave, if we needed the peristaltic wave, it's going to take 5 to 8 seconds to get down there. And I said, for a lot of things that we swallow, if it's a liquid or fluid, the material reaches the stomach faster than that. But those peristaltic waves allow us to get food we can swallow even upside down, which I had some volunteering going on to try and do that for extra points on the exam, but we won't do that right now. Okay, peristaltic waves get coordinated by neural innervation of smooth muscle. There, we're going to pick up that the very upper part of the esophagus is skeletal muscle, but about a quarter to a third of the way down the esophagus is where we transition from skeletal muscle to smooth muscle. And this is where we're going to be picking up and using a lot more of the myenteric plexus of the enteric nervous system. Now, smooth muscle will run then from just about a quarter of the way down to a third of the way down the esophagus, all the way up to, but not including, the external anal sphincter. I've seen a question about that on release national dental boards. Okay, so most of the length we're dealing with smooth muscle. Okay, so what's happening when we get to the stomach as we're approaching the stomach? This peristaltic wave approaches, and what's going to happen is, as the peristaltic wave is moving, like I said, forward, or in this case down the esophagus, we reach that lower esophageal sphincter, which is tonically contracted. And one way that peristalsis works is, as the peristaltic wave is moving forward, we have in front of it is a wave of relaxation. So as the peristaltic wave is coming down the esophagus toward the stomach, we get an automatic relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter to allow the food, this bolus of food that we're pushing forward, to drop into the stomach. Okay? So that seal is pretty important between the esophagus and the stomach, because the stomach is going to produce this low pH environment. Okay? Gastric secretions have a pH of about 1, and the stomach, the pH as it mixes with whatever you're eating, the gastric pH is going to drop down the range of around 3. Okay, so it's a pretty acidic environment. And we don't want that acidity to leak out and into unprotected areas. So if it's gastric chyme is going into the duodenum, we know that the pancreas is going to help to neutralize that chyme. But we don't have that same ability to neutralize the chyme in the lower esophagus. So we need to protect the lower esophagus from that acidic environment from the stomach. The way we do that is the secretions of the esophagus. We said in the previous lecture, we have those mucus secretions, okay, which is a protective barrier. And in the lower portion of the esophagus, we see heavy addition of bicarbonate to those mucus secretions. So that if we do start to get gastric chyme coming up into the lower esophagus, that at least we've got some bicarbonate to try and neutralize it, and the thick mucus to protect the cells. So that's the second thing that we have, protecting the lower esophagus. So number 1 was the lower esophageal sphincter. Number 2 was the thick mucus with the bicarbonate. And protective mechanism number 3 is when, just before emptying into the stomach, the esophagus passes through the diaphragm, goes out of the thoracic cavity and into the abdominal cavity. The pressure in the abdominal cavity is greater than the pressure in the thoracic cavity. So this esophagus, which is malleable or flexible, when it passes through the diaphragm, the greater pressure of the abdominal cavity tends to push up against the esophagus. And it's sort of like if you took a garden hose and turned the water on, and you can see the water flowing through the hose, but then if you put a crimp in the hose, you can cut the flow of water off. So this is a physical barrier to the stomach contents getting into the lower esophagus. That's the third protective mechanism. Now, if you start compromising those mechanisms, then you can start to have problems, and you can see what's called gastroesophageal reflux disorder occur, heartburn. Okay, And one of the things that can cause that is if you get rid of this crimping, then that takes away one of those three protective mechanisms. Well, how can you get rid of the crimping? If the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter and esophagus move up into the thoracic cavity. And that's what can happen with what's called an hiatal hernia. Okay, so you don't get the crimping anymore, and GERD is one of those things that you can see with it. Okay, another thing to be aware of, so here's the intra-abdominal pressure thing. Some people have better protective mechanism than others, and that their lower esophageal sphincter doesn't relax well. And if that happens, you can get a situation where you eat, you chew your food, you swallow your food, but the food isn't getting out of your lower esophagus. It starts to accumulate. Okay, and that's called achalasia. And it can stretch out the esophagus, make it even more difficult in the future for the esophagus to empty. So achalasia is a problem caused by the lack of full relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay, so now what's going on in the stomach? The stomach, when I think of the stomach, and I spend all these hours each day thinking about my stomach, is I think of two things, and you gotta be careful about how you remember them. I'd say the primary function of the stomach is to store food and to release it to the small intestine in aliquots small enough that the small intestine can deal with it. It's the small intestine, especially the duodenum, that's doing the and jejunum subsequently. That's where most of digestion is taking place. It's doing the bulk of the work. So the stomach's there that we can eat and then store that food as we get things processed, maybe start to break the meat apart a little bit, and then, but release it in smaller doses that the duodenum can handle efficiently. Okay, that's the primary function. The indispensable function of the stomach is its ability to produce and secrete intrinsic factor. That's why we absolutely need a stomach, is to make that intrinsic factor. And I said that when we were talking about secretions. So know the difference between what's the primary function and what's the indispensable function. Okay? So we get food entering through the lower esophageal sphincter. It first comes into the cardiac portion of the stomach, then the main body or fundus of the stomach, and then the antrum is the portion of the stomach closest to the pyloric sphincter, which is the exit. So what happens is food entering the stomach is going to start to stimulate weak gastric peristaltic waves. So your stomach, we saw at the beginning of this lecture on motility, we saw the slow waves for the stomach. And so there's constant contraction and tends to be some peristaltic waves. Now the presence of material in the stomach is going to start peristaltic waves occurring more than they did before. They're not strong, it's just kind of an indication the stomach is awakening. Now in the beginning, they're going to start partway through the body or fundus of the stomach and proceed toward the pyloric sphincter. Okay, and this is helping to mix the secretions of the stomach with what you ate. Then as these go along, as they begin to mature, as you're digesting, these contractions are going to do two things. They're going to start to become stronger, always moving in the same direction. And it's going to start coming further and further up toward the cardiac portion of the stomach. So what we're doing is we're getting these secretions mixed in with what you ate, and now we're beginning to push it. And push it as it gets stronger, we're starting to mix more. And as we're mixing more, we're starting to bring it further and further from the esophagus and pushing it toward the pyloric sphincter. So this is where we first see mixing reactions taking place. Okay? And as they go along, picture that they start out, and as they get closer and closer to the pyloric sphincter, they're getting stronger too. That's going to accentuate that mixing effect. Now, meanwhile, the pyloric sphincter is still contracted. So we're trying to force food through the pyloric sphincter, but we get that backwash, and that's the mixing reaction. Now, as these contractions become stronger, then the pyloric sphincter begins to relax a little bit, to the point where now we have, every time a new peristaltic wave is approaching the pyloric sphincter, it relaxes a little bit, and maybe 1 to 2 mils of the most fluid chyme is going to escape the stomach and get into the duodenum. So we're making our chyme fluid now, which also is going to assist the duodenum with the digestion. So we're getting little 1 to 2 mil squirts each time the stomach has a peristaltic wave, which is going to be, what, based on the previous, the first slide in this grouping, about every 20 seconds. So we're putting in aliquots into the duodenum. Now, the stomach has these peristaltic waves too, and they can be intensified if you haven't eaten in a few hours. So if your stomach's been empty for a while, what it can start to do is, even though it's still empty, is start these peristaltic waves, doing the same thing, contracting, and the longer you go without eating, this is theoretical for me, the longer you go without eating, then these contractions become stronger and stronger, just as though you'd eaten. Except now you don't have food in there, you have some gastric secretions that are still there, and you also have air, gas that you swallowed as you'd eaten. So now, if you've got these peristaltic waves, one, as they become more and more intense, you start to feel them, okay? And the other thing is, you start to be pushing gas toward the pyloric sphincter, and then it backwashes. And it's something I used to be able to do, I can't real well, I can't do it anymore, don't worry, is if you put, inflate your cheek, and then have air go through, kind of punch it, it sounds like you're, no, not popping, but quack like a duck. Like that. Not that that's what a duck sounds like. Quack like a cartoon duck. Okay, so it just, that would be turbulent flow of air. So your stomach can do that, end up doing that, and so that's your stomach rumbling, or grumbling, and kind of, it can start to hurt. And if you still don't eat, it goes on, it can become really intense contractions, to the point where it causes pain. Those would be hunger pains, okay? Now, the good news is, if you still don't eat after they start, after a couple of days, 4 or 5 days, those weaken, and it no longer is painful. So next time you're watching Naked and Afraid, you know, after 4 or 5 days, it'll be okay. I only watch Naked and Afraid for the stories. So gas trap, that's causing the things to rumble. Okay. Now we talked about the secretions previously. My indispensable comment. Now, the pyloric sphincter is the barrier from getting out, and it's going to allow the most liquid of the chyme to exit. So the stomach is also parceling out the most fluid components of the chyme while it's breaking down the more solid pieces that you swallow. Chyme becomes more fluid, peristaltic waves more intense, start to empty the stomach. Gastrin can stimulate those contractions. Okay, now, what happens when we start to empty things in the duodenum? learned about that when we talked about control of secretions. As material chyme from the stomach enters the duodenum, you stimulate the release of cholecystokinin and secretin, and both of those feedback and tend to inhibit the stomach from further emptying, so to slow it down, which is working together with the stomach and the peristaltic waves that are getting stronger. We're just going to parcel out what's coming into the duodenum, give the duodenum time. Okay, so those are components of the, and there's also the enterogastric reflex. So distension in the duodenum can cause the stomach to slow down, inhibit gastric emptying. So stimuli that stimulate the enterogastric reflex, it involves enteric nervous system, paravertebral reflexes, which would be from the enteric, from the duodenum back to the spine, back to the duodenum, or long loop reflexes, which would be duodenum to the central nervous system, the medulla, and then out through the vagus back down to the stomach. What kind of stimuli are good for triggering these reflexes? We've got 4 of them listed. Low pH of the duodenal chyme. Okay, that's a good stimulus for what? Secretin. The presence of amino acids and peptides in the duodenum. That's a good stimulus for peptides. Some gastrin, but think cholecystokinin, CCK. Fat and protein are the 2 best ones there. And notice that with the low pH, it's like give us time to neutralize the chyme. With the peptides, it takes longer to digest the peptides than it does the carbohydrates, so give us time to do those. C, hypo or hypertonic chyme. This is a protective mechanism for our body to maintain osmolarity. Okay, it's not good to have too much water, it's not good to become dehydrated. And the time you hear about this is if people, the most common time to hear about it is people as a challenge or end up overhydrating themselves. So the last one I heard about was a radio station that was running a thing about can you drink a gallon of water in this short a period of time. And somebody managed to kill themselves or something. It was hypoosmotic shock. What's the other one I was thinking of? If you slow down gastric emptying, we talked about that already. Your stomach gets distended, that's what's going to cause you to stop eating and to discontinue feeding for the moment. So if you try and drink a lot of fluid, the same thing is going to happen. Have you ever had that? Have you ever been really thirsty and you just parched, and so you wanted to, it's like, I just need a cold glass of water. You drink a glass of water, and it's not enough. You drink a glass, another glass. Have you ever gotten to the point where you're just so dehydrated and thirsty that you wanted to drink more fluid, but you just couldn't, even though you could use it? That's because the stomach is slowing down the rate of emptying if it's hypotonic. So one of the things you can do to try and improve that is drink something like Gatorade, which has electrolytes and wouldn't be hypotonic. And then fat and duodenal chyme, which also is effective release for CCK. So those are a little bit of gastrin, which stimulates the stomach, but the secretin and cholecystokinin can inhibit the gastrin effect.
So does water just like flowing and mixing with the chyme?
Yeah, well, it would be a part of the chyme. You put in the gastric secretions with the water. Okay, so now we're into the small intestine. And once you get into the small intestine, it takes 3 to 5 hours to traverse the small intestine. This is where the real work takes place. How do you get from one end of the small intestine to the other end, from the stomach to the colon? Peristaltic waves, just pushing things along slowly but surely. And we're getting two things that are happening there. While we're moving the material, the chyme, along the length of the small intestine, that's the motility part, we're also, this is helping to mix the secretions that are entering from the liver, stored in the bile from the gallbladder, made in the liver, pancreatic secretions, and then also secretions of the enterocytes themselves. Okay? So we keep layering, as the peristaltic waves come along, we keep relayering what's in contact with the brush border and the enterocytes, which improves absorption as we go along. Peristaltic waves, only 3 to 5 centimeters before they peter out, and then we increase them again, generate another one. Okay, those peristaltic waves become more powerful and project further as a result of what's called the gastroenteric reflex. For reflexes, remember that the first word or first half of the name is where it's originating, second half is what's being affected. So this would be the stomach affecting the small intestine. What would we want to do? Stomach, tell the small intestine, clear out what you got because more is coming. That would be the gastroenteric reflex. So we'll start with stomach distension, also the release of gastrin, cholecystokinin, 5-HT, insulin, all of those, but I'll start with gastric distension, causing a stimulus of the myenteric plexus, which is going to flow through and stimulate the motility of the peristaltic waves in the small intestine. Okay? Secretin and glucagon being a signal of the bad times, tend to inhibit this reflex. Why would it make sense that secretin should inhibit the enterogastric reflex? What's the best stimulus for secretin release? Low pH. So why might it make sense that secretin inhibits the the enterogastric reflex?
Is this acidic?
Huh?
Is this acidic? Maybe it's acidic.
Yeah, it means it would be a sign that the duodenum was acidic. Let's give it that material time to be neutralized by secretions of the pancreas before we push it along. Does that make sense? If the early duodenum is acidic, let's take our time, make sure it's neutralized before we move it along. So secretin inhibiting the enterogastric reflex, or the gastroenteric reflex, sorry, makes sense because it gives us time to neutralize the chyme. Now, on the other hand, if you have a local irritation in the small intestine, what will happen is you promote a reflex increase or hyperactivity of peristalsis. So it's sort of like, oh, this is caustic, get it out of here. You know, so if we increase, make a strong peristaltic wave, and have it proceed quite a ways down the small intestine, then we're going to excite that new segment, which is going to do the same thing. And so we can get material moving through the small intestine pretty quickly. Said 4 to 5 hours just for something neutral to move through it. But if we generate what's called peristaltic rush, we can move through pretty quickly. Anybody ever experienced peristaltic rush? Chances are good at some point. We had, one year we had, it was in the fall, I could do it. I have a pretty big garden at my house, and so I grow things including hot peppers. So we got a couple of volunteers in class, and we did an experiment. And we had a couple of people who volunteered to eat the hot peppers, and a couple of people volunteered to eat sweet corn. Now, sweet corn is pretty non-threatening as foods go. But then we had them time and figure out when they pooped. So the hot peppers, you know when the hot peppers are leaving the body, right? It burns. That's why we had them eat, the other group eat corn. You can tell when corn is leaving your body too. So that was our two markers. And just to see how fast could we stimulate peristaltic rush and see how fast the peppers left the body. The experiment didn't work real well. People forgot to record the time they pooped and things like that. But if you want to do it, unfortunately, in the fall I have my ripe hot peppers. Now I don't have any, so we can't do it this year. Unless you want to go to the store and try it. Go, some of you buy corn, some of you buy hot peppers. Doesn't look like you're enthusiastic about trying it. Anybody ever eat Thai food? I love Thai food. I go and I have even ordered it with 4 stars. We had to convince them to let us. They will only give 3 stars to regular old Caucasian Americans. But they've been there enough, and they said, okay, we'll do 4. I like it so it's hot enough that my nose starts to run. And fun to go out to eat with. But I also had a good timing on how quickly it moved through my system really quickly. The peristaltic rush can accomplish a lot in a short period of time. The idea here is just our body trying to protect itself against something, and capsaicin can certainly be the kind of insult we need. Okay, so that's what peristaltic rush is, and if we rush through the duodenum, if we don't give the small intestine time to work, and then later the colon, the chyme reaches the anus before we've had time to reabsorb or absorb a lot of the fluid. And so feces are in the form of diarrhea. So it's another fun part of peristaltic rush. Don't worry, we haven't even gotten to pooping and vomiting, but we're about there. Okay, by the time we get all the way to the ileum, we've absorbed a lot. We've absorbed pretty much all of the nutrients that we're going to absorb. The only thing left to deal with, we still have a fluid chyme. The only thing left of real value that we can deal with when we enter the colon is water and ions. But our nutrients are pretty much gone. In order to pass from the ileum into the colon, we have to go through the ileocecal sphincter, or valve. And what it's there to do is slow the rate of emptying of the small intestine into the colon. It gives us our last shot at absorbing nutrients. Also trying to help prevent us from overloading the colon, because the colon's job is going to be to extract a lot of this fluid and the ions that remain. Okay, now the valve slows that emptying. That valve also relaxes following a meal. We mentioned that one. That's the gastroileal reflex. And what that's saying is when we eat a meal, primary function of the stomach is to hold on to that food and dispense it in the aliquots. So our stomach's distended, and that's going to reflexly cause relaxation of the ileocecal valve, which is basically the stomach telling that valve, hey, we got more material coming, gotta get rid of what you've got right now. So you eat, and then whatever is remaining there in the ileum starts to empty out into the colon. Okay. Now, once we get into the colon, we looked at, I don't know if I mentioned it in the secretions, but the colon secretes mucus. The mucus is going to serve 2 functions. One, it's going to, the proteoglycans and glycosaminoglycans are going to help to tie together whatever's remaining, the particulate matter in the chyme, okay, to help to turn them into solid feces. And also, as the feces become more solid, in particular, the mucus is going to help to let them slide along easily. Okay? So bind fecal material and lubricate. As things are moving, colon's absorbing water, also absorbing ions. A lot of the times the water is following the ions, isosmotic reabsorption. We don't get nutrients being absorbed there. So problem with peristaltic rush is you're not going to be getting nutrition through basically anytime you're getting diarrhea, you're probably not getting full nutritional value from what you ate. If you have tactile irritation in the colon, it would be called enteritis. There's increased motility of the colon, less absorption of fluid, and consequently diarrhea. This is a part of the lecture where we keep ending up with, and consequently, diarrhea. And this part is really using technical words. When we pass through the ileocecal valve, the chyme is really like a slurry. It's a fluid. Okay? Then we have those mixing contractions, formation of hostrations, and the absorption of the water following the ions. So as we're moving through, as we go up the ascending limb of the colon, we're removing quite a bit of water. And then as we go along the transverse portion of the colon, things start to get thicker. Okay, so we get, use the term semi-mushy. And then once the feces are starting to become semi-mushy, we start to get propulsive contractions. So we start to move away from that spading kind of motion or contraction to now we got to move things, our job is about done, we need to move things out the other end. So we're propelling the feces now along the transverse colon. It's the distension by the feces contributing to those peristaltic waves, and gastrocolic from the stomach, oh I just ate, to the colon, time to get rid of what you ate yesterday, and duodenocolic reflexes, oh the stomach's emptying, now it's time to get rid of what you ate yesterday. Those reflexes are contributing to the feces being propelled toward the rectum. Those contractions last for around 10 to 30 minutes and are propelling the feces into the rectum. The rectum normally doesn't have feces in it. Once the rectum is occupied, then you get what's called the defecation reflex. Okay? And that's basically getting rid of stuff in the colon, making room for new chyme. There was in one of the previous editions of Guyton, textbook in medical physiology, spent like half a page on, I exaggerate, a long paragraph though, on what can happen if you fight through consistently the defecation reflex. Because this is when you feel the need to poop. And everything is set up to cause defecation, but if for one reason or another you don't do that, the defecation reflex can gradually diminish. So like with little kids, when you're trying to toilet train them, we had a number of my grandsons that they wouldn't poop until you put a diaper on them. They're okay peeing, but it's like something, no, I don't want to sit down and poop in the toilet. And Guyton spent this long paragraph about what can happen to your child if they don't want to do that. That does not mean every time you get a defecation reflex that you should do it. Okay, so during lecture you should leave and go to the bathroom or something. So next person to leave the lecture, you know where you're going. figured out how to keep people in lecture hall. Okay? So, what's up with defecation? Normally the rectum does not contain feces. When it does, that's what's triggering this. It's a fecal distension of the rectum. That provides us with the urge to defecate. I feel the need to poop. So what happens then, when we need to poop, how do we accomplish it? We need contraction of the rectum, which is smooth muscle. That increases the pressure on the feces. Then we need to relax the internal anal sphincter. And isn't it nice? We've got two doors here. It's a double door we have to get through. There's the internal anal sphincter and the external anal sphincter. Internal anal sphincter is smooth muscle. External anal sphincter is skeletal muscle. So rectum contracts, internal anal sphincter relaxes, and then the external anal sphincter also has to relax. Now, because the external anal sphincter is skeletal, it's under cortical control. So this is your last defense, that, oh, this is not the appropriate time or place to poop. And so your cortex can say, contract, and keep that external anal sphincter contracted. Okay? And sometimes that may not be enough, but usually it is. Okay, so where's the control for all that going on? We have to have cortical control for the external anal sphincter, and then subcortical control for the smooth muscle. Subcortical control, there's the intrinsic defecation reflex. That feeds out to the enteric nervous system, and that's producing weak peristaltic waves. So you get a bolus in the rectum, and it starts pushing on the bolus. And that's, you feel the need to poop, your enteric nervous system is starting the whole process. Parasympathetic defecation reflex, that's carried by the pelvic nerve to the internal anal sphincter. That's starting to relax the internal anal sphincter. So no matter what you're thinking about, no matter where you are, this stuff starts to happen. It's putting you at risk to poop. Then cortical control, that's that external anal sphincter. Now you're in a place and a time when it's okay to poop, defecate, so you relax your external anal sphincter, and that reduces the resistance to movement of the bolus, and you can poop. Now, maybe that hasn't reduced the resistance enough for you to actually poop. So the next thing you can do then is, again, cortical neurons, the cortical control of skeletal muscle, is you can contract your abdominal muscles to increase intra-abdominal pressure against the lowered resistance. That may assist. Or, if that's not even enough, what you can do is take a breath. Inhale, close your glottis, and then contract your internal intercostals to put increased intrathoracic pressure, pushing the diaphragm down on the abdomen. That's called a Valsalva maneuver. And that increased intra-abdominal pressure would be enough, hopefully, to overcome the resistance. Okay? And that's more likely to occur if you're constipated. That's enough about pooping. Let's talk about vomiting instead. Before I started teaching GI, Eric Glendy was a member of he was a professor at the physiology department. He taught GI physiology to the dental students, the nursing students, the medical students. He wasn't a GI physiologist, but I think it was because nobody wanted to talk about GI because of things like pooping and vomiting. But we all do it. Okay, so vomiting, variety of different stimuli can cause it. We'll come back to that in a moment. But things like excess distension or irritation of the duodenum, okay, that would be a commonplace for things to start happening. So either irritation, let's say due to bacterial metabolism, maybe acidic food that you ate or hot food that you ate, a variety of different things. So it can be chemical, could be tactile, or just excess distension of the duodenum. What happens there is we can sense that. We have vagal and sympathetic afferents, so those are carrying that information back up to the central nervous system on parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons, but afferent neurons. And it goes to the medullary vomiting center. Yes, you have a vomiting center down there in the medulla ready to help you out. And what the medullary vomiting center does is then stimulate a process called anti-peristalsis. Remember when I said, oh, here's a kind of troublesome or scary word? Usually, peristalsis runs from the oral to anal direction. We have the enteric nervous system, the myenteric plexus, is also wired to be able to not just coordinate in the one direction, but coordinate in the opposite direction. And so, in this situation, we get what's called anti-peristalsis, and this can start all the way down at the ileum. Okay, normally I'm picturing the duodenum is getting it started, but anti-peristalsis all the way to the ileum. Something was about to enter your colon. I'm almost ready to get out of here, and what happens? It gets pulled all the way back toward the duodenum. Okay? These waves travel at 2 to 3 centimeters per second, so we're starting to really pull things back toward the mouth. As that's happening, we're distending the duodenum more. So let's say it was an irritation that was triggering this, and now as the anti-peristalsis goes along, more and more material's there, and we're distending it more, which is just going to what do you call it? Positive feedback. It's going to make things even stronger. So we got the chyme distending the duodenum. Now, once we get to that point, the stomach contracts strongly, the duodenum contracts strongly. At that point, the lower esophageal sphincter starts to relax a little bit. And once we get that happening, a series of 4 or 5 things happen in quick succession. You'll take a deep breath, you'll raise your larynx and hyoid, so that's going to help and open up the upper esophageal sphincter. You're going to close your glottis to protect your airway and lift the soft palate to increase resistance to material flowing into the nasal passage. Okay, so we're closing and protecting our airways. Once those 4 things happen quickly, then your diaphragm and your abdominal muscles contract, skeletal muscle. They do that in order the diaphragm comes down, the abdominal muscles contract inward, and consequently intra-abdominal pressure goes up. So now you've got a lot of material in the stomach, and pressure's going up, and now we need to see where it's going to go. All we need to do is give it a low resistance pathway. So right now, finally, the lower esophageal sphincter relaxes, releasing the resistance, and the chyme flows down its pressure gradient, which is up and out the mouth. Okay, so that's what's involved with vomiting. This was the I think I mentioned the best case of flu I ever had was in grad school when I was studying this, and I got the flu, and so I spent the night studying it by reliving it. Okay, so we said that distension or chemical irritation could cause vomiting and trigger it. Another good stimulus for vomiting is nausea. I feel sick. Right? I feel nauseous. You keep using that word. If you put in, you might say I am nauseous to be, but oftentimes you say I feel sick or I feel nauseous. And so feelings, that's cortical. Okay? So nausea can, in some way, cause us to vomit. Now, the way that's gonna work is, if we get different compounds in our blood, they can get to the chemoreceptive trigger zone, also it's called the nociceptive center. It's located in the brainstem, and it's notable because it lacks a blood-brain barrier. So it's basically exposed to what's in your blood. And so if we get something in our blood, toxic compounds, etc., it can cause us to feel nauseous, including toxic compounds such as acid aldehyde. How would you get acid aldehyde in your blood? Huh? Alcohol metabolism can cause acid aldehyde accumulation, and that's what can cause people to feel nauseous. Okay, so the presence of these different possible compounds in some way, I don't know how it works, causes discharge of those nociceptive center neurons. So things, appropriate stimuli would be chemicals, so drug or alcohol catabolites, such as acid aldehyde. Psychic stimuli, so strong emotions can trigger your chemoreceptive trigger area. And then the other one, really neat example, is your inner ear. Have you ever gone on the teacup ride? I went to Disneyland for a conference. Actually, it was at the Anaheim Convention Center, but it was right across the street for Disneyland, so figured I had to do it. And they had the teacup ride. And so we had 5 PhDs and who were postdocs at NIH, and Rich, who is a 17-year-old master's degree candidate at Johns Hopkins. Rich was the smart one. So we had a little bit of smartness there. And so we went on the teacup ride, and we decided, so we had a challenge. Did I tell you about this? Okay. Who's been in the teacup ride? Okay, we could fit 3 people in that teacup. There's a little handle in the middle, and if you pull on the handle, you can rotate your teacup, and independent of all the other teacups. And then, at least the one at Disneyland, there were 3 teacups on a platform, and the platform would rotate. And the one at Disneyland, they had 3 platforms on a larger platform, and it would rotate. So we had all of we had a lot of IQ points going for it. And I have to admit, they just went along with my idea. It was my idea. Said 3 of us getting this one, 3 of us getting this one. And then we should get our cups spinning as fast as we possibly could. That's a reasonable thing to do. What was the stupid part of it was I said, and once we get them spinning, we'll see who can get them spinning the fastest. Everybody went along with it and said, okay, I thought it was a good idea. Okay? My wife thought it was a good idea to marry me. She's regretted that for 40-some years. So we get in the teacup, and before it starts, we even worked out, hey look, you can put 2 hands on this, and you put 2 hands on, you put 2 hands on, and we'll pull, just like we were on a crew team or something, and we'll pull. And we literally were yelling, pull, pull, pull. And when the ride began, you're sitting there, and you had to be careful to get your hands so they didn't run into each other. We start pulling, pull, pull, pull. And then I can still remember going, okay, I think we're going as fast as we can. Do you think? And they said, yeah. I said, okay, let's see who's spinning faster. And I looked up. I hadn't pictured this part. The whole world was spinning around. I had no idea where that other teacup was, let alone how fast it was rotating. I don't feel quite as bad because nobody else thought of it. And I was also instantly nauseous because as long as I was steering that middle thing, the little handle in the middle, was not rotating relative to me. and everything was comfortable. But the moment I looked up and the entire world was just flipping around, instant nausea. Okay? That's another way to trigger your nociceptive center.
Did you vote?
No, I didn't. I was just I didn't do that, but as long as I was staring at that handle, I could handle what was going through my semicircular canals. The unfortunate part was the ride ended. And so the ride ends, and all the rotation stops, and they come and they open up the door, and I was okay as long as I kept staring at that handle. To the point where they finally said, "You have to get out of the teacup now." I needed help to be able to walk off the platform. It was like, that's wonderful. So that was my personal experience with this. A non-personal experience has to do with the space program. When they first started looking for astronauts, they had to be in good shape. That kind of precluded my participation. A number of other things, but one of the tests they put things through was they put, you ever seen those, like you can stand in a circle that's in another circle and another circle and you can kind of rotate? Well, they put people in something sort of like that, but they sat them in a chair and they rotated them. And if the people got motion sickness, they were out. Can't be an astronaut. And those that passed that test, they put them back in the chair, they rotated them one direction and then the other. This, by the way, passes its coordination for me. Okay? So they rotated in both the X and the Y axes. And if they got motion sickness, they were out. Can't be an astronaut. And the ones that remained, you put them back in the chair, you put them in a chair that simultaneously did X, Y, and Z rotations. If I had a third arm, I could try that, but I would fail. Okay? And what did they find? Everybody got sick. Okay? Anybody simultaneously rotating in X, Y, and Z axes gets nauseous. So they had to keep those people. But if you're on a ship, and the ship is wallowing in seas and going, you're pretty much getting the X, the Y, and the Z. Okay? Some people are more sensitive to that than others, and they get motion sickness. I think that was the end, or did I have this? Nope, that was it.